Hey everybody, Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography. This video is about a feature that all the latest Canon bodies have. It's called Register and Recall a Shooting Function. And today I'm going to demonstrate how I use it when I have a certain shooting scenario where birds in flight are passing between fully lit areas and shaded areas. And how you can use Register and Recall a Shooting Function to instantly change your exposure from what you have set manually in your camera to a different exposure, either for the sunny part or the shaded part, and you have full control over it. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO, manually set. No meter, no camera meter involved, and I'll get into why that's important. So, if you're interested in learning how I use Canon's Register and Recall a Shooting Function to help me out and get the exposures on my birds that I want, stay tuned. Ron Bielefeld, Whistling Wings Photography, out in the blind again on a very windy morning. And so this could be a little tricky doing this video out here today, but we're going to give it a shot. Today's video is about a feature that the most recent Canon bodies have. The R3, the R7, the R5, the R5 Mark II, the R1, they all have this feature called Register and Recall a Shooting Function. And I love it. It is so cool to be able to use that function and assign it to a back button and have it do all sorts of different things for you just when you push that button. In this video, it's about shooting in a scenario that I found myself in more times than you would think when you're shooting birds in flight. And that's when a bird is transitioning either from full light to shade or from shade to full light. And there's almost like a dividing line, right, that it passes through. And you can use Register and Recall a Shooting Function to set up a discrete, separate exposure for either the shaded side or the bright side, whichever way you want to go. I usually have the button and Register and Recall a Shooting Function set up to initiate the exposure for the shaded side, but you can go either way. And of course this function can do a lot of other things too, but this video is about using it in that scenario. And like I said, I found myself in this scenario more than you think. Not too long ago when I was shooting short-eared owls, a lot of times when I'm shooting the kingfisher, the perch is in the sun, the water's in the shade, shooting barred owls, flying from the shade into the sun, from the sun into the shade. What else? Ospreys have done the same thing. So we're going to go through how this works, and I'll show you how to set it up on one of your back buttons. Before we get into that, though, I know there's going to be people out there that are going to be saying, okay, well, that's fine. This could be interesting, but why? I already have in my brain other ways you can deal with that. A bird going from shade to sun and sun to shade in flight, why don't you just use, for example, auto ISO? Or how about shooting shutter priority so that the meter then comes into play, and when it's in the shade, it's going to be a certain exposure based on exposure compensation settings, let's say, and when it goes into the sun, it's going to automatically change its exposure based on the metering, saying, ooh, the meter says, oh, there's a whole bunch of light now, I'm going to change something, whether it's ISO if you're in auto ISO, if it's aperture, if you're in shutter priority, whatever. Sure, excuse me, sure, you can go that route, but you know what? Many times it's not going to work for you. Why? Well, it didn't work for me very well. Why is that? Because you're bringing the meter into play. And what is the camera's metering off of? We're talking about subject photography here, a bird. You need your bird exposed the way you want it to be exposed. Not the background, not the foreground, not the overall scene. Like if you were shooting landscapes or something like that, you're worried about the entire scene being exposed the way you want it. Not with birds. You want your bird exposed the way you want it. You set your exposure for your bird in the light that it's in. The meter isn't going to meter off of your bird. And so if you're using auto ISO or shutter priority, or heaven forbid, I say heaven forbid, aperture priority when you're shooting birds in flight, it's going to meter off of some bigger part of the frame luminosity than just your bird. And many times that's not going to work. So for example, and it might work sometimes when the bird's luminosity and the overall scene's luminosity change together. But what about if the bird flies into light but the background stays in shade? Or the bird's in shade and the background stays really bright? In those metering modes, other than full manual exposure where you're controlling the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, it's not going to set the exposure based on your bird. It's going to set the exposure based on the luminosity of the overall scene, and many times the bird's going to be exposed incorrectly or not the way you want it. So the only way to really work with this, and why register and recall a shooting function is the way to go, is because you're setting a full manual exposure that when you hit a button, it switches to that exposure. And of course, you're going to set that exposure for the shade area or the full sun area for your bird, nothing else, not based on background luminosities or anything else. Now you're saying, well, I'll just put my metering mode to spot, and then it'll meter on the bird. Will it? How big is that spot metering area? It's pretty big. It's not some little tiny spot. And you're going to keep that, this is birds in flight now. You're going to keep that bird in that little circle, and it's going to meter off that bird accurately through flying from sun to shade, shade to sun. If you can do that, more power to you. But even, I can tell you right now from experience, that even if you keep that bird right in the center of that dot, that circle area for the spot metering area, it's not going to be accurate most of the time. So I turn to, anyway, register and recall a shooting function to get to setting an exposure for my bird for one or two of the other, when we're either in the shade or in the sun. And then when that bird crosses that dividing line from shade to sun or sun to shade, let's say, I just move my finger over, hit the other button, and it goes to that other exposure set for the bird. Same autofocus, same everything else, and we've got the right exposure, and we keep tracking that bird. And so I love register and recall a shooting function, and I use it for this type of scenario to get my exposures right. Hey, I'm gonna take a break from this video really quick, and I'm gonna put in a commercial for my speed shooter harness system. I make them. I make every one of them by hand, and I ship them out directly to you. And I'm not gonna say much more than that. You can see what the speed shooter does through the commercial, and after the commercial, we'll get right back to the video. Thanks so much for watching. So let's go inside my viewfinder on my Canon R5 Mark II, and I'll show you what we've got going on here. Okay, so we have a bird, and it is in rather bright sun. And I have my exposure set to 1/640th of a second at f7.1 at ISO 1000. Again, this isn't for the bird in flight. This is just a demonstration of how this setup works for putting it on your back button. I have another bird out there that's set in shade. And if we go over there now on this same exposure, if I can find the bird, this should be fun, right? Oh, there it is. You can see that that same exposure over there on that bird is too dark. So we're going to set a different exposure for that bird, the shaded part, versus the sunny part over here. And that would be our settings then for birds in flight, going from the sun to shade, shade to sun. So let's go into the menu, and we'll go over to customize buttons for shooting, and we'll go down. I set this up, I use register and recall a shooting function on my autofocus point button, which is the far right back button on the back of my camera. If we go in there and we go into the info, the detail set, of course I can't see what I'm doing here. Can't get to the button with this on there. You can see that we have a bunch of parameters that we can set in here that will then be initiated when we press and hold that far right back button, the autofocus point button. And so let's go through and set it up for the shaded area. We've got our regular exposure on our camera, our main exposure, if you want to put it that way, set for the sunny part. Let's set this button initiation of a different exposure. Let's set that for the shade. So we're going to go down to shutter speed. Going to put check marks. You put check marks in this column like that, and that means when you press the button it's going to use that parameter. We're not going to do one for shooting mode. We want it to stay manual. I have my camera set in manual exposure mode, full manual, no auto ISO, no nothing, of course, like we said. Shutter speed's going to be important though, and again, this is for these static subjects, but you can think about this in terms of much faster shutter speeds and stuff like that if we're shooting birds in flight in this same scenario. So I'm going to take that shutter speed and I'm going to bring it down, right? Bring it down to where I think it's going to be okay for that bird in the shade. Let's just go to 1/250th of a second and we'll see how that looks once we get in there and see the bird, actual bird. Then we're going to go down into aperture, and we'll go ahead, because see, you can set everything this way. It's not like if you're using auto ISO or aperture priority, shutter priority. You can set your full manual exposure to be exactly what you want, getting the parameters for your shooting scenario exactly the way you want them. So in aperture, let's bring that as wide open as it can go. I think in this case it's 7.1 or 6.3. Let's go 6.3. Then we'll go down the ISO speed, and because we're in the shade, let's bring that up a little bit. Let's just put it at 2000. Let's put it there, and we can refine this. Let me go down. Our autofocus area, we want it to be the same as what we're shooting with our other back buttons, let's say a zone. So I'm going to take the check mark away from that. So it's not going to use a different autofocus area. It's going to use the same one as in the main autofocus menu. We're going to come down, subject to detect is going to default to birds, just like we have it set. So we don't need to put anything special there. Go all the way down. Autofocus operation, of course, we do want it to autofocus as we're pressing that button as well. So that's it. That's the setup. And what we basically did was change the exposure like we've been talking about. So let's see if this exposure is actually okay so you can see what happens. If I go over here now to that bird and I hit that button, see how much brighter it goes. That's the regular exposure. That's the new exposure. The regular exposure from the camera's manual setup parameters for the exposure, and this is the new one, brighter. I think that's not too bad for that. If we come over here now to back to our bird that's in more sun, we can find it. It's always a trick when you're doing this kind of thing. There we go. So that's our regular exposure from our camera, and I'm hitting the autofocus on button now. Now I'm going to go and hit the autofocus point button all the way on the right, and you can see it gets quite a bit brighter. That's the irregular exposure through the camera's manual exposure setup, and that's the new exposure we set up in the register and recall a shooting function, set to initiate when we press the far right autofocus point button. So as you can imagine now, as that bird is flying from the sun to the shade, the minute it crosses, or even before, if you know where it's going, crosses that shade line, you move your thumb over and you hit your autofocus point button and you go to the brighter exposure, and then you're in much better shape keeping that. If I can find the bird again. This is always fun, right? There it is, right there. So boom, there, that's the brighter exposure. That's the darker exposure set up on the camera. The brighter exposure, again, is the one that we initiate by pressing the autofocus point button, the far right button, using register and recall a shooting function. So again, I think you can see how as you're tracking a bird, it's in the sun, you know it's going to hit shade, you just move your thumb, keep tracking the bird, you move your thumb over, you hit that autofocus point button, it's going to brighten up your exposure using the same autofocus area if that's what you want. That's what I would suggest you do. And you just keep on tracking the bird with a much better exposure, an exposure you set and control completely without the camera's meter coming into play and most likely getting it wrong. So I think it's pretty cool. I think that's really a neat, I love this function that Canon camera bodies allow you to use. Like I said earlier, I think you can see how, stop my recording there of the viewfinder. I think you can see how you can use it in other ways. How I use it a lot is just to change the autofocus area. Not to change the exposure or anything else, but just to use it to set up that third button, that autofocus point button, to use a different autofocus area. I usually have it to the locked spot. So I have my 3 back buttons: zone, full frame tracking with eye detection, and then a locked spot all the way over on the far right button. That's it. That is it. I hope you see the utility of register and recall a shooting function, and you'll give it a shot. I'm pretty sure a lot of you find yourselves in a scenario like I'm talking about, where you've got shaded and sunny areas, and birds may be flying into and out of those areas, and having 2 different exposures that you can grab, that you control, that you totally control and set for the bird, not for any other part of the frame. You set for the bird, and you can just move your thumb back and forth between the 2 buttons to get the exposure as close as you want it to. It's never perfect, but you can get it much closer. And of course, with the dynamic range of the sensors these days, the images we're getting, the raw images, you're going to be well within the realm of correcting it in post-processing, and away you go. Hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Of course, if you have any questions or comments, in the discussion down below. Until next time, I hope you have great light. I hope you are getting great images. Be safe out there, and I'll see you soon.